we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the current chair of the History Department, and thank you very much for joining us today. We also have Amanda Nelson helping us behind the scenes with the logistics of the book club. We're kind of pulling more of it from other offices in CLA into house at the History Department. So I'm very grateful to Amanda for taking time this evening to join us and help us out with that. And we're also continuing this year. I have been shaking things up a little bit with the book club. We have featured books of alumni and faculty, but I have also brought in other speakers and other themes in a way that reflects how the historical profession is moving and developing, and increasingly that historians are producing knowledge collaboratively. They are sharing knowledges in new ways. We're still writing books, we're still writing journal articles, but many are also doing public history projects, working with community engagement. And that's what we're going to feature in tonight's discussion. So we're going to have this discussion about, so what use are historians about scholar activism? And to lead us in this discussion, we are bringing back an alum, as we like to do, Nikki Berg Burin, who finished her PhD here in 2007 and wrote a dissertation on pre-Civil War plantation owners in the US South. And but her work now that she has been based at the University of North Dakota in the History Department and in the it's a Department of History and American Indian Studies, has moved in new directions that are really connected to that place and its engagement with it. And we'll get a chance to hear about the really interesting work that she's doing that's community engaged and how she brings her students into those projects. And very appropriately, we'll have in conversation with Dr. Berg Burin, Kirsten Delegard, who is not a graduate of our program, but we're very happy to have her, working here at the university. She holds an appointment in the university library system, as well as faculty affiliations with the Department of Geography, Environment and Society, and the Heritage Studies and Public History program. And she is co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice project that some of you may have already heard about, and now Historiopolis project. And she will also be sharing some of that as she engages Dr. Berg Burin with in conversation. So we will have some time to hear from each of them, to hear a sort of Q&A between the two of them. And then towards the end of the hour, there'll be a chance for you to bring in your questions. So as you're thinking of questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll remind you as we get closer to that time period that you can do that as well, and I will read them out and you can join in the conversation that way. But with that sort of preliminaries, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Nikki Berg Burin to get us started this evening.
Well, hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Sarah for the invitation to be a part of this, and to Kirsten for engaging in this conversation with me tonight. It's really an honor to be here and to see some familiar names in the audience there. So my research right now is focused on the history of sexual violence and exploitation in North Dakota. And I've got a couple different projects that I'm working on, but the big one is a book project that looks at those issues in the period of Dakota Territory and early North Dakota up to about 1920, though I'm still figuring out the end date for that work. I didn't realize it at the time, but this project started about 9 or 10 years ago. And if you might remember, some of you out there, that this is about 2014, 2015, And at that moment, the Bakken oil boom was in full swing in North Dakota. So Western North Dakota especially was experiencing tremendous change in terms of the landscape with the fracking that was going on. There was an influx of money, and especially there was an influx of people, specifically men. And pretty early on, we started to notice, and the media started reporting on some of the concerns and problems that have historically been associated with so-called bachelor societies, especially in Western communities associated with extractive industries. We started noticing some of those things were developing in Western North Dakota. One of those issues that was of particular interest to me, and we kept hearing increasing amounts of report in official media reports, but also social media, unofficial accounts from people out west, is that there was an increased rate of prostitution and, alarmingly, sex trafficking. So I had been teaching about human trafficking on a global scale in my Intro to Women's Studies course for a number of years. So hearing about this problem in my own backyard was really alarming to me. And right from the start, I just felt compelled or called, however you want to look at it, to get involved. And so it was that moment that my historical research started to shift a little bit. And I suppose at some level, my identity as a scholar, how I saw myself. So one of the first things that happened is I made a decision that I was going to get involved in some of the anti-trafficking efforts in the state. And they really were non-existent up to this point. North Dakota was really far behind much of the rest of the country in terms of its anti-trafficking initiatives, in great part because it just wasn't on anybody's radar, or at least not on most people's radar. So I've long believed that historians need to have a seat at the table where problems are being solved. I have no delusions that historical knowledge alone is going to fix all the problems of the world, but I do think historical perspective is essential to understanding them and crafting effective solutions. So when calls went out for people to kind of join the movement, if you will, there were a lot of organized efforts. I thought that I might be able to lend a hand, given that I had a little bit of knowledge about this and I really cared about it. So at the same time, given that as I was starting to volunteer and serve in some different capacities on a, public service level, I wanted to be prepared to offer my insights and my skills as a historian should the opportunity arise to share them. And so I started researching the intersection of the history of sex work and sex trafficking in North Dakota's first economic and population booms, the late 19th and early 20th century. I thought that this would be a really important point of comparison and contrast that might offer some insights into what we were experiencing in the 21st century. I tended to focus in those early days on public awareness or public perceptions of sex workers and sex trafficking victims, as well as the ways in which the laws around those issues developed over time. So that work, both the, serving on some organizations and state committees about trafficking and doing the research, anti-trafficking research, that occupied my time for several years. And then the pandemic hit, and the brakes were hit on a lot of that, at least the volunteering and the service that I was doing for a short while. And my research took a little bit of a turn, but a related turn. So for example, in 2020, I was part of a team here at UND that had received a grant to digitize archival materials for the general public. We were tasked with choosing some items from our archive here on campus and putting it on our digital repository, the UND Scholarly Commons. And we were especially interested in choosing items that were relevant to public school teachers or useful to them, and also the general public. So one of my tasks was to go through this massive collection of papers from former US Senator and North Dakota Governor William Langer. While I was going through this enormous collection, I stumbled across this very slim file that had to do with a statutory rape case from 1918 in a small town in North Dakota. Langer was Attorney General at that time. And what I found in this file was community outrage about a 52-year-old resident, his gross violation of a 15-year-old girl, and also outrage that the state wasn't doing anything about it. They really wanted justice to be served and action to be taken. This particular case really, I don't know, struck a nerve with me, struck a chord with me for some reason, for lots of reasons. And I did a little bit more research and found that there was just as much outrage about the fact that this man was being charged with a crime at all. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of vitriol, addressing or targeting this young girl, that she wasn't a legitimate victim of a crime, lots of questions about her sexual morality, her sexual history, and so on. And this research is happening in the context of our modern day context of Me Too. And so, I personally was kind of, very interested in the Me Too movement, still am. But I thought so much of what I was reading about in 1918, we're still dealing with it today. But the one thing that really frustrated me is that this was a statutory rape case. The key factor in those kinds of cases is the victim's age. And this particular victim was 3 years under the age of sexual consent. So it's a pretty cut and dry case, but not at all. When you actually look at the court records and the public discourse, it wasn't cut and dry at all. And I wanted to learn more about age of consent laws and how they shaped public perceptions of girls and sexuality and girls' own sense of self, and how that has also influenced certain attitudes and policies today. Well, in the course of doing that research, I learned that the early efforts to raise the age of sexual consent in North Dakota, which was 10 for most of its history, was directly linked to efforts to eradicate prostitution, especially for women's groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. One of their biggest arguments for raising the age of consent was that when a girl was sexually ruined, and that would have been the language of the day, basically put her on a direct path to prostitution. And so they were raising alarms. We need to pass these laws to protect not so much girls, but to protect their chastity so that they don't end up on this path. So my research projects were starting to come together a little bit. And then I also noticed that a lot of the discourse of groups like the WCTU, it was very alarmist. The language they used was dramatic. Girls are in danger right now. There are traffickers around the corner. There are seducers. There's predators. We've got to protect them. And I wanted to know, how much of a threat were these kinds of problems to girls? Is there a way to quantify the rate of incidents of sexual violence and exploitation? And so with a couple of students, I built a database, still a work in progress, but we built a database. It covered about 50 years or so, and we had over 850 unique incidents of sexual violence and exploitation in the way that we defined it. So I, for the first time, started to see all of these different forms of violence come together at one place. And I realized that what I had here was a book project. It wasn't all these little individual projects. And so that's what I've been working on. I think that it's a project that is very relevant for today, not just because we're still dealing with these same problems and many of the dynamics around them are still the same, but also I think those early efforts to address and make sense of these problems, try to solve these problems, or ignore them even, helped create a culture of fear that still shapes and affects the lives of women and girls and beyond in a negative way today. I think that those early decisions are still shaping some of the culture and certainly the policies in North Dakota. So given the relevance to our current society, I'm really committed to making sure that my work is public facing. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a public historian, as I wasn't trained in that and don't necessarily know all those methods, but I do want to make sure that my work is accessible and that it's engaging the public. And I've tried to do that in some different ways that we'll talk about, I think, today. So that's what I'm doing right now.
That is so cool. I just want to say. And so as we're talking, if either Sarah or Nikki, you could put some of those sites in the chat too, like for anything that you have written, or I don't know if your database is at all public or if there's any kind of publicly accessible materials, but I think that would be really interesting. So I so appreciate that wonderful, compelling description of the historical urgency of the work that you are doing and the challenges that you're responding to in a really direct way, and why you started doing the kind of work that you're doing. So just to give some background about me, I think we probably have a lot of I mean, there's a reason that we're having this conversation together. We have a lot of parallels in the way our intellectual biographies have developed. So like you, I was trained as an academic historian. And I did my dissertation and my early research on women in politics. And so today I'm still doing 20th century US history, but my approach and my methodologies are radically different from the ones that I learned in graduate school. So in graduate school, I was taught to do sort of academic interventions and to focus on a conversation with a small group of specialists. So now, even though, like you, I was not formally trained as a public historian, I consider myself a public historian, which essentially means that I'm striving to do work that's co-creative with community members, not always successful. And like you, I'm trying to do history that addresses community need, and creating narratives and resources that are widely available to a lot of different kinds of people. So, I think all historians are trying to open historical imagination, right? But I think one thing that's maybe just more distinctive about people who consider themselves to be public historians is that we're always trying to think about how it relates directly to contemporary needs. So like you, I took this turn as a public historian when I came back to my home state of Minnesota. So you returned home to North Dakota, and that was another inflection point for you. And for me, it was coming to a place that I really consider to be home, that really prompted me to want to use my historical training to help my family members, my friends, my neighbors understand the racial disparities of Minneapolis and how they were deliberately created by racist practices that have created material barriers to housing stability for people who are not white. So this interest of mine led to Mapping Prejudice, which is here, as Sarah said, is here in the University of Minnesota Libraries. And with Mapping Prejudice, my team mobilizes community members to transcribe racial covenants, which were clauses that were inserted into property deeds that prohibited people who are not white from occupying or owning certain parcels of land. We use digital tools. So my teammates have developed sophisticated software that is able to comb through millions and millions of pages of digitized property records to identify those records that seem to have these kind of racist clauses. And then we mobilize community members. We use crowdsourcing, and we use very intense community engagement, old-fashioned community engagement work to get community members to read these primary sources and transcribe the information that we need to make a map. So all of that has made me think long and hard, like you, about the relationship between history and activism. And that's the thread that we were interested in exploring for this session of the History Book Club. And I think it could not be more relevant, right, at this moment in time, not only because of the kind of particular challenges that you are trying to address in North Dakota and my team is working on here in Minnesota, but history is under attack everywhere. I mean, I'm hearing just really, really disturbing stories from around the country. I just came back from a public history conference where I heard a lot of really, really upsetting stories from people. And of course, history at the same time, history is being defunded and even eliminated in a lot of academic institutions. I mean, all these institutions that have supported the study of history over time are really under they have had a severe loss of public trust, I would say, and are under all kinds of budgetary and political pressures. So I think at this moment, it's never been more salient to ask the question, what use are historians? Why are we essential to democracy? Why are we essential to our contemporary civic health? What kinds of contributions can we make as historians to make meaningful social change? And how, what's our role in the larger what some people have called the wheel of social change. Like, so if we know that we are in concert with people with a wide variety of skills, and it's not just, as you said, historians can't do it all alone, how do we work with community organizations and activists and direct service providers to support change that addresses the needs of communities that have been marginalized and oftentimes harmed by the institutions where we're working. So those are the big, so I don't think we're going to settle all those questions in the next half an hour or so, but those are the questions that I'm really delighted to be here thinking about with you. So I'm curious about how this work is different from your, I've talked a little bit about how I was trained as a graduate student, but how is this work different from how you were trained, and what were the challenges as you sort of shifted your thinking? Yeah.
Certainly the topic is different. I never thought that I would be a North Dakota historian. I'm really glad to be. When I first kind of shifted into doing North Dakota history, I really felt it, and being a North Dakotan myself, it was really a tremendous honor and responsibility to do that. I do think some of the issues you're raising about the attacks on history, I worry about that sometimes with the nature of my North Dakota history that I'm doing, and doesn't quite fit into the standard narrative of North Dakota history, but it has to be told, and it has to be a part of that conversation and that narrative. So the topic is definitely, at least the geographic location is different than what I had been trained in. And so, this goes beyond the question of public history, but just having to learn a whole new historiography. In some ways, I feel like a grad student again, having to learn all of this history that I really had no familiarity with other than what I learned in grade school myself. But I think some of the underlying issues of, I studied slavery and I studied enslavers, and how women in particular oppressed other people and other women that they held in slavery. Some of those same issues, you can see a theme in the modern day slavery that I'm researching, but even just in general, the issue of, violence and exploitation. If that's not a part of the history of slavery, American slavery, and I don't know what is. So some of those larger issues are certainly relevant. The public history piece of it, I was thinking back about my grad school experience, and my first really professional experience was when I was new at Minnesota. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but I received a grant from the North Dakota Historical Society that involved you had to write an essay about your research, and they published it in a cute little newspaper with my picture and some other pictures, and they distributed it around the state, and then you had to go and give 5 or 6 public presentations. So really, my first professional experience was actually with public history, even though I probably didn't really think about it in that way at the time. After that, though, I kind of followed the traditional path. I always expected that I would write my book and I would publish the academic articles, and life takes twists and turns, right? And then suddenly there's a crisis in North Dakota, and I saw an opportunity to do something that was perhaps more meaningful to me than some of the more traditional academic work that I had done in previous years.
That is very inspiring. So tell me, as you came to this topic, was it just I know this is not true, that I know you were thinking about it as a member of this place, or as a resident of this place. So you weren't just approaching this from an archival perspective. How did you start working with community organizations, and how did those collaborations change the way you think about research and think about writing history?
Yeah, the first anti-trafficking effort in North Dakota was through a coalition that called themselves, the acronym was FUSE, a Force to End Human Sexual Exploitation in North Dakota. It was kind of a weird acronym, but they really just put out a call for people who wanted to. I think it was a board that they had, and it was a pretty big board, but you had to submit an application that was pretty straightforward and just say, who you were, why you were interested, and what your skills were. And I can remember reaching out to the organizers, because they were looking for social workers and law enforcement people and, people with legal expertise and whatnot, social services. And I said, I'm a historian. Do you have any any place for somebody like me? And they said, absolutely. And so that was my first step. And once I got on that board, I was kind of put in the public awareness raising group. And so we talked a lot about what do we need to educate the public about? What do they need to know? And what's the best way to do that? And that led to some public service campaigns. You know, I wasn't necessarily they weren't all my idea, but I was part of those conversations. And in that early experience, nobody said, hey, Nikki, tell us about the history of this. But every contribution I made was informed by my historical research and my, my role as a women and gender studies scholar as well, right? That those kinds of concepts and ideas, something I really emphasize with my students when we're talking about trafficking and prostitution as well, or the commercial sex industry, is how complicated it is, how complex the intersections are. And oftentimes we like to see things in black and white. And despite the best intentions of people on that early board, I saw some of that. So I would try, and I wasn't the only one, but I would try to introduce some of those complexities or nuances and get us to think about things in a, not necessarily a historical way, but, just a little bit different way, a little bit more nuanced way. So I think I'm losing track of your question now. How did I get started with that is what you asked, and how has it shaped my research, right?
Yeah. I think it's interesting just what you said initially, that you said, hey, I'm a historian. Can you use me? And they were like, yeah, we can. And I wonder what they thought they were getting and whether or not you were what they expected, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that partnership kind of blossomed into other opportunities. I ended up being a consultant with the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force and worked with them on some of their projects. I was able to partner with some other organizations and put on some community events here in Grand Forks. So I don't know how they thought of me as a historian per se, but certainly as the lady at the university, I think they welcomed my willingness to do some of the work and to offer my perspective, and I really appreciate that. One of the things that working with these different organizations and people has done is, first of all, it keeps you humble. We talk a lot about our areas of expertise, right? And once I'm in a room with social workers and lawyers and law enforcement officers, survivor leaders especially, I realize how small my expertise is. And I don't say that to belittle myself or denigrate what my work, but rather to just, it illustrates that I'm just one piece of a much larger effort. I've got something to contribute, but they do as well. And those different perspectives have really influenced the way that I approach my research, especially the survivor leaders. I went through enough trainings during that time period to learn about the fact that in the anti-trafficking movement, and I hope this is starting to change a little bit, survivor leaders were treated kind of like they were in the abolitionist movement. We want you for your story. Stand up and tell your story, and then you can just go away and let us do the rest of the work.
Wow.
And so hearing them talk about why it's so important to have survivor leadership and kind of victim-centered approaches, that has greatly influenced the way that I write about the history that I'm studying. I really try to take a victim-centered approach. And I really learned that from them and from my experiences with these different organizations.
So there's a question from from Michael Rapp, who asks, can you give a clear and concise description of public history? Which is that is impossible. No. No, I mean, what most people will say is that it's history that does work in the world, and that there's many, many, many different forms that public history takes. But one of the central values of public history is co-creative knowledge with community. So it's not just public facing work. It's not just work that's accessible, but true public history is supposed to be co-creative in some way with community members. And one of the best examples of a co-creative history effort, I think, is any kind of oral history, where you're creating a source with a narrator. So, and then there's all kinds of other ways to co-create knowledge with communities, but that's probably one of the most common forms of public history.
That's a great explanation.
Well, thank you, because it is a very slippery, there's obviously endless arguments about what public history is. So I love that you that these relationships that you are building with these community members is the people who are involved in this, in either as survivors or in this movement, are really changing the way you are doing research and writing and thinking about your research and writing. And that's how I feel too about that I feel like every time I'm in conversation with folks, I'm learning so much, and my work is so much more nuanced and rich because of those conversations. So I know when we were getting ready for this, one of the organizations that you talked about being involved with was Historians Against Slavery. Is that distinct from from the other work that you have talked about, and can you talk about that group in particular?
Yeah, especially since they're trying to revive themselves. If people are interested, I can certainly provide a little bit more information. My Historians Against Slavery was a nonprofit organization created by historian James Brewer Stewart. I want to say around 2007 or 8, although I'd have to check on that. And he was a professor of history at Macalester College, right in your neck of the woods. So the idea, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the idea was to basically combat modern day slavery with studies, research, conversations about historical slavery, kind of exactly what we're talking about here today, using historical knowledge, historical skills to try to make sense of what's happening in the world today and try to combat it, try to make a change for the better. And the neat thing about Historians Against Slavery is that it was a collaboration between scholars, traditionally trained historians, and lots of people who were working to combat slavery on the ground. So survivor leaders, people working in anti-trafficking organizations, lots of different, lots of different people were a part of this, serving on the board and participating in, I think it was a conference every 3 years that they had. The Historians Against Slavery has a book series through Cambridge University Press. I think it's called Slaveries Since Emancipation. Unfortunately, there was a change in leadership at the same time that the pandemic hit, and the organization lost its website, lost its administrative help, and just kind of like many things during that stretch, kind of just went quiet for a little while. But we just had a meeting of the old board a couple of weeks ago, and there's a new revival. They're trying to get up and going again, and the focus has shifted not away from, but it's become more inclusive. One of the big things that Historians Against Slavery today is interested in is mass incarceration, and how that is part of these larger conversations about modern day slaveries. So it's it was a really neat opportunity that I was contacted by them through my work with these other organizations. I knew some of the people involved, and they saw what I was trying to do in North Dakota as a historian, and thought I'd be a good fit. So I'm really thankful for that opportunity to work with people. That keeps you humble too, working with people who are just doing amazing things. And it's inspiring, but also, makes you think, I got to do a little bit more. I got to keep up.
So as you're talking about Historians Against Slavery, in some ways we're coming up on Passover,
Right.
which is a Jewish holiday where you contemplate ancient slavery and its modern manifestations. And one of the things that you talk about around the Passover table is just how to commit in your contemporary life to combat a modern day slavery. So it just feels, I just really appreciate people who are trying to see this, connect the past to the present and help, to help us figure out how we can make a difference today. So, I mean, how do you think it makes a difference? When you talked about making these conversations more nuanced, trying to break down some of these binaries, trying to break down bring your training as a gender scholar to the contemporary activism. What were the understandings of sexual exploitation in the past that were helpful in the present in terms of helping people to think in new ways? Yeah, and I mean, to put it more bluntly, why do we care about the past? Like, why do we have to know? Because that's something that's a question I get a lot about about racial covenants and about housing inequality and racial disparities today, people say, why are you, let's just focus on going forward, because it doesn't really matter what came before. What matters is what's coming in front of us.
Right. And I would probably say, but you can't understand what's in front of us unless you understand where we came from.
Yeah.
So I think on a practical level, studying history to address modern day problems, it helps us understand that. How did we get here? And sometimes maybe it's a direct path. Most times it's not, right? It's not, I can't say this happened in 1890, so therefore that's why this is the way it is in 2024. But understanding those historical roots are essential to understanding the nature of the problems we have today. And I think also can provide guidance in how to address those problems. Of course, there's lots of other things you have to consider, but it's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. I think also, especially when it comes to controversial issues, and we're both, dealing with controversial issues,
Mhm.
it can be really hard in our society today, especially it feels, I'm sure every generation has said this, but it feels more divisive than ever. It feels really divisive. And I think it's hard for people to sometimes take a close look at what's going on around them and critique it. Whereas if you offer a historical model, that's separated, right? That's maybe it feels safer. It feels okay. We can look at that because that's not us. That's something that happened in the past. And so it's an opening. Once we've done the work of analyzing, understanding, exploring similar issues in the past, then it's not such a big jump to take that analysis and apply it to the present. And it might look very different, what we find, but I think it's a way to open those conversations in a way that's non-threatening to anyone and just absolutely crucial to understanding contemporary problems.
Can you give me a specific example of when that worked? Can you think of something? I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but is there a time where you could see like the light bulb go on, or like the aha moment for people when you explained it from a historical perspective?
Oh boy, you are putting me on the spot. When was there a light bulb moment? uh,
Maybe there
well,
wasn't. I don't know. So
what's that?
maybe there wasn't, but I'm guessing there was. But it's sometimes it's hard to.
I think it's more when I have, been in, public events and talking, especially on panels where there are people who are, professionals and other professions than, they're not scholars. They're working in other fields. And I start talking about history. You can see the light bulbs going, that people recognize some of what I'm saying is relevant to what we're talking about in the present. And it's like, oh, I had no idea. So then I think it's the task of the public historian to help them make that leap. Okay, here's that historical knowledge that we've just uncovered or that you've just learned. What do we do with it? How do we apply this to situations in the present? And I'm not sure I've completely figured that out. It's a work in progress, but I'm definitely committed to it.
Yeah. So let's talk about sources. We're already talking about oral histories as being a really classic public history methodology. So what kind of sources are you using, and how are they different from the ones that you were trained in graduate school to use? And what are the ethical issues involved in the kinds of sources and on this topic that you're
Yeah,
working on?
I was really fortunate to have a giant collection of family correspondence that formed the basis of my dissertation research.
Mhm.
So just a tremendous amount of letters to and back and forth between family members. Um, that is not what I'm working with now. I wish I could find letters that talked about the issues I'm researching, but people didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
No, that's how do you do the history of something that people didn't discuss, and you have to work around it a little bit. And so most of the sources I'm using are public records, court records. I just spent the last 2 days looking at criminal case files from district court in the state archives, newspaper accounts. One of the problems with those public records, at least for the time period that that I'm studying, is that they're very white, they're very androcentric. The victims, the survivors, their voices are almost entirely absent. Really, the only place that I'm finding their voices are sometimes in court transcripts, trial transcripts, but often those haven't been preserved and haven't been saved. So, trying to, especially as I mentioned earlier, trying to take a victim-centered approach where I really you know, I kind of, I'm of this moment in the world. And I mentioned the Me Too movement earlier, which was all about listening to survivors. You know, obviously you would have due justice or due diligence, but that's not what's meant, or you don't automatically accuse somebody of something, but you listen to survivors, you support survivors, you give them a supportive space to tell their stories. I'm really trying to do that as best I can with very limited sources. And so just trying to keep that in mind as I work with these sources is really an important issue. A related issue that comes up with that, especially when dealing with sexual violence, is who am I to tell these stories? I don't have consent from these survivors. You know, most of them are no longer, well, probably all of them for the time period I study are no longer living. So trying to be very thoughtful, respectful about how I'm telling these stories, knowing that I don't have consent. I mean, most of these people did not have privacy in the newspapers. They didn't have the laws that we have today that protect victims' identities. So their names are all over the, you know, newspapers and the court records and whatnot. But as a historian, I can make some choices about how I approach this. And again, I don't have any clear answers or directions for that yet. I'm figuring it out as I go, but it's always guiding the research that I do and the way I approach these sources.
It sounds hard, you know, it sounds like really hard work. And you know, that's where like the really great history comes from, you know, really hard, you know, hard, but there's a lot of emotional labor in the way you're describing it in this work. And how do you think about that, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, there is a lot of emotional labor. I noticed it especially when I had two undergraduate students who were my research assistants last year when we built this database, and we were scouring old newspapers for reports of incidents of sexual violence. And I think I had mentioned earlier, we ended up with over 850 incidents for the time period we were studying. And when you're doing that work, you kind of get in a rhythm, right? You're just entering names, you're entering data. But when you step back and you see these 850 names that are attached to real people, many of whom were teenagers, it really kind of hits you hard. And one thing I think I didn't do well was prepare my students for that, in part because I didn't prepare myself for it. I didn't know what to expect.
Mm.
You know, I'll also just say that when telling the stories, not just reporting numbers, but telling the stories of individuals, I've on a couple of occasions gotten choked up in presentations. And of course, oh, I'm so sorry, give me just a minute, I apologize. And every single time, audience members say, don't apologize, like that, you know, that they are supportive. It humanizes, you know, that emotion, those feelings humanize the history. And I think it actually makes me a better historian, tapping into some of those emotions than trying to just shut them off. I mean, you have to be a professional, obviously, but I think I wasn't trained like this. I don't think it necessarily even came up. But you know, if you look back at the profession of history, emotions would not have been a part, not something we would have encouraged necessarily when we go way back. So just acknowledging that there is an emotional labor that comes with this kind of work is the first step, I guess. How we deal with it, we just got to find our ways to take care of ourselves, I think, and remember why we're doing the work.
Yeah, and I mean, it is horrible. You know, it's an appropriate reaction. And I think if you didn't have that reaction, I'd be more worried about
Right.
then, you know, that would be really bloodless and sort of extractive, much more extractive, I think. And it's not, yeah. So I don't know. I just feel like that's something that we have to embrace more. I mean, in terms of being the full range of humans as we do our work. But I think that's a good lead into my next question, which is about research and teaching, and what's the relationship between the two? Because I think sometimes historians think about research and teaching in two different buckets, and you are clearly bringing those two things together in this work. You know, as most public history is very, you know, is very team oriented. You need to bring students into it. But I mean, besides just labor, what else, what other ways why else is it important to bring students into this, and what happens when you do, and how do you work with your students, and especially considering the difficulty of this topic?
Yeah. I early on when I started teaching Intro to Women's Studies, and we addressed a lot of or looked into a lot of these kinds of issues, it was the issue that students responded to the most. Probably like campuses all across the country, if not the world, my women's studies classes tend to be populated by people who identify as women. And I think these kinds of topics really hit home with them. They could relate to it, and they just responded to it into all these different kinds of issues in a way that they didn't with other topics that I would study. And so I knew that there would be student interest in being able to engage in some research on this topic. Another thing to think about is that oftentimes I think students don't know what we actually do as historians. They know we teach history, right? But they don't see what we're actually doing in our in our projects. So
Yeah.
to bring them in is really kind of exciting for them to see that and to be a part of it. I don't want to jump on anybody or, I know we're going to answer some questions, but I saw there was a question in here about, is the role of the historian to make social change? Not necessarily, but for me, yes. And so to have the opportunity to work with students who also feel that way and to help give them an opportunity to
Yeah.
kind of craft their own path, that's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good transition. What do you think, Sarah? Should we?
Yeah, sure. We have both a comment and then a question. So maybe I'll read the comment and then I'll move to the question in reverse order here. Barry Benson says, all I have to do is see in real time how we are repeating mistakes of the past. In Louisiana state legislature in recent special session on crime made gassing people an option for the death penalty. In short, what the Nazis did is okay here now. Now they're trying to repeal it. So these issues do come back. And then Kirsten Fisher says both, thanks for this wonderful conversation, Nikki, and then asks, have you found any vocal victim-centered critics of the Women's Christian Temperance Union's approaches back in the day? People who challenged the concern with women's reputations over their experiences. And a contemporary question, please talk about the interaction of historians opposed to modern day slavery with the movement on behalf of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Thanks for the questions. I think I'll start with the last one. I'm just reading it again over here in the chat. I think that there is not enough interaction between the MMIW or MMIP movement and the anti-slavery movement. And I can't say that I'm an expert on why that is, but I know in the in the anti-trafficking circles that I was moving in, there certainly was some representation from the Indigenous community and those who were working on missing and murdered Indigenous women's issues. But I often felt like it was treated as a side issue rather than a central issue, especially when you think about the demographics of a place like North Dakota, where Indigenous women are overrepresented amongst trafficking victims, amongst victims of sexual violence and whatnot. So I think that needs to be, moving forward, that needs to be a better connection or a better partnership in those movements. The vocal victim-centered critics of the WCTU approach. One of the best examples is Helen Hamilton Gardner, who was a suffragist and really she worked with the WCTU because she knew they were powerful, but she definitely criticized their emphasis on virginity and chastity, and she herself focused, when trying to raise the age of consent, focused more on the sexual entitlements of men and the sexual double standard, and that is what needed to be criticized. And I think her national leadership on that issue did influence the WCTU and these local and regional chapters, and kind of they started incorporating more of that language into their own critiques. I haven't found in North Dakota any vocal critics, but I would love to find that. Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with the WCTU. Incredibly, progressive for their time period, but also so regressive in many ways. And so it's really interesting working with that organization's documents.
Yeah. Well, and so few people understand now, people just sort of dismiss them as these sort of fringy anti-drinking women, instead of understanding the really, in some ways, very revolutionary, radical nature of their critique. So what other parts of the question?
We have another, I guess, comment from the chat and from Anna Freiberg, who's a recent undergraduate major from our history department. And congratulations, Anna. I see she's going to be starting a public history MA program. So she says, I'm so glad I tuned in tonight as someone who's also interested in advocacy and the history of sexual violence and about to start a public history MA program. I've been struggling with trying to marry those interests, and this was reassuring. So thank you, she says.
Yes.
Yeah. Good luck, Anna. We'll look forward. You'll have to come back and share with us in the history department some of the projects that you do in public history. We
Absolutely
would love that. I want to, as we wait for some more questions or comments to come in, I was thinking, as a Latin Americanist, I have not been engaged in history that's rooted in the place where I live currently, but I was thinking about the question of missing and murdered Indigenous women and wondering if there are potential, and this isn't something I expect either of you to answer, but just sort of thinking off the cuff here, for these kind of transnational connections, because one thing that's happened in Latin America is in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of military dictatorships in Latin America, and state-sponsored violence, disappeared people who were taken by the government and killed, but their bodies not provided. And then there's been a recognition that even in the post-authoritarian regimes and the transition societies, that there have been very high rates of missing and murdered women and girls as well, femicide in many of these countries. And so there may be possibilities for some kind of transnational thinking about both maybe historically how these issues develop, but also how in the contemporary period there may be ties as well.
Yeah, have you seen transnational connections, Nikki, in your I mean, you're very close to Canada, but which is significant.
I mean, certainly in the trafficking issue, I would imagine that there's a lot of that, whether it's happening in North Dakota, I don't know, but I think that trafficking and modern day slavery is very tied into transnational migration movements.
Absolutely. Well, during the boom, we knew that, they were using two main corridors. Traffickers were going, west across I-94 and up to Canada on I-29. So yeah, I mean, I was not privy to any conversations between, I guess, change makers, activists or advocates across the border. But I would be surprised that, they very capable people working on the ground here in North Dakota. I'm sure that was on their radar and, trying to address these problems. But you're right, looking at it in that transnational perspective is not only practically smart, it's smart on a practical level, but also I think it would just open new insights into how to combat the problems.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Barbara Welke. Nikki, it's wonderful to see you, and thank you both for this conversation. Nikki, do you feel supported by your university in doing the kind of public history you're doing, and what are the range of forms that support takes?
Yes, I do. And hi, Barbara, thank you. I do feel supported. UND has had different programs over the last 10 years that really are about meeting community needs and trying to fund research that is about those urgent needs, especially in rural areas of the state. And I was a recipient of some of those grant monies back when when the boom was happening, because they very much saw trafficking as a rural need or a rural problem. It was a problem in the urban areas too. So definitely supportive in that way. And I mean, just a personal plug, I was recently offered a tenure track position here. My research is all about this. So they made that offer, even knowing, knowing what I'm doing. So I definitely feel supported in that way as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, another comment from Mary about I-10 also being a major sex trafficking route, and congratulations coming in for you, Nikki. Kirsten has, I guess, kind of the other question. You do feel supported by your university, which is wonderful, but she wonders, have you received pushback from people who would prefer not to have these aspects of North Dakota history publicized? And if so, what happened in those instances?
Not yet. I haven't had a lot of materials, out in the public yet, at least printed materials. I have an article coming out in the North Dakota History Journal sometime this spring that's all about age of consent and male sexual privilege and all of these things and entitlements that we talked about. And I hope there's a positive response to that. I am trying to prepare myself for some of the negative response. I think the context that Kirsten provided earlier about that pushback against history in general, but especially these kinds of histories, I would be surprised if I don't get a little bit of pushback. But I think I will have the support of my institution, and these histories need to be told, and I'll stand by that. I'm not. I imagine some of it, the pushback that could possibly come might be about the topic. It might also just be about my approach to it, and the way that I am very deliberately trying to make connections to the present. Some people might not think that's what historians do or should do. And those are important conversations to have. As long as the university continues to, stand behind me and my colleagues, I've got a really supportive department. I will feel confident moving forward. But thankfully, so far, and the truth of the matter is, when I'm speaking in public and having these events, the naysayers don't usually show up. The people who are there are those who want to learn or who are already in support of the issue.
Right. We're getting close to the top of the hour, and I want to give both of you a chance if there's any sort of last words that you really want to get in to leave us with this evening.
Well, I guess I'd like to wrap up our portion. I would love to get some. I found so much about this to be inspiring, but can you talk, Nikki, and like what have the outcomes been of this work? Like what changes have you seen in North Dakota because of this organizing? Just leave us with a little bit of sense of possibility, I guess. Assuming I know there have been some outcomes. So
yeah, absolutely. And these aren't direct outcomes of my work. Was just one little person in the efforts, but North Dakota adopted anti-trafficking laws during the oil boom. That was a big piece of the work that we did right away. We have a lot more public awareness campaigns that you can see, and we see this in lots of places around the country, but in rest stops along the interstate, trainings for law enforcement. I think one of the big changes, at least when we're talking about trafficking and prostitution or sex work, is the shift in attitudes from law enforcement approaching people engaged in that industry, not necessarily as victims in need of services, because some aren't victims in need of services, but not seeing them as criminals, even though on the law books, prostitution is still illegal. That shift in attitude comes directly from the trainings that the anti-trafficking organizations in the state have been offering for law enforcement. And I think that those ideas also are trickling down to the larger society. I find people want to talk about this, whether it's trafficking, probably lots of people want to talk about trafficking. I think that's a whole nother conversation, right? The way that we kind of, I don't know, kind of a voyeuristic, aspect of that. But there are people who want to address these issues, especially in a place like North Dakota that's very politically conservative. A lot of the folks who might feel a little bit more socially progressive often feel isolated, and having these kinds of public conversations are a place for them to come out, and conservative-minded people as well, and actually have productive conversations together. I've seen that happen. I think the anti-trafficking movement actually is one of the few places where you see people across the political spectrum. You see sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. You see Christians, and you see all sorts of different people at the table. That's a model for productive conversations on any issue. And so they're not always the best conversations, but they are there working on a problem together, which is really important.
Well, that's a wonderful, that's a wonderful place, a very positive place to end. And I think we've had a wonderful, very productive conversation here this evening. We will give people a chance when we end the recording that if you want to greet Kirsten or Nikki or have a little bit of informal time afterwards, we'll do that. But now I want to bring the formal session to a close. I want to really thank Nikki and Kirsten for sharing these insights, the really interesting and super important work that they are doing in the communities and in historical research, and in bringing those two together. They have let us record this, and it will be available. So if you want to share that later with other people who would be interested, that is a possibility. We're going to take the summer off from the book club, but we will look for your emails soon of some sessions coming up for the fall. We do have some of our younger faculty, newer faculty are coming out with some books, so I think we'll be featuring those as well. So, and then finally, I guess if Amanda, yes, she's put in the chat, if you happen to have the possibilities, we like to support our current graduate students, knowing that they are going to go on and do really important work like Nikki is doing now in North Dakota. And so if you are able, we invite you to give to our History Graduate Fellowship Fund to support the important work that they're doing, and as they will go out and make their careers. So thank you, and good evening.